So let's get on with it. So you guys, welcome back. I hope you are going well and you're enjoying our event. We have right now a talk about code of conduct from our dear friend Reza Rahman, and why you should adopt an open source code of conduct. That's an interesting subject. Companies probably should attend to it, but let's hear about it. So Reza, the stage is yours. Let's go.
All right, excellent. So thank you very much for coming to this talk and watching this talk. I do hope you get something out of it. Most certainly, this is an important talk from my standpoint. It's a talk that I've been wanting to give for several years now. This is a topic that has been top of mind for me for a while. So frankly, I'm very grateful to the committee and very grateful for TDC for having the opportunity to present this material. As you can see, the title of the talk is Why You Should Adopt an Open Source Code of Conduct. My name is Reza Rahman. In my day job, I'm Principal Program Manager for Java on Azure. But this talk is not more or less not about my day job. As you can see in the from the title of the slide, or rather the title slide, I'm actually want to represent the Jakarta Ambassadors, and we'll talk a bit about the Jakarta Ambassadors for this talk because this content is much more relevant in the Jakarta Ambassadors context. Either way, if you have questions or concerns, you can always reach out to me. I do have my email and Twitter handle on the screen, and otherwise, I'm also pretty easy to get a hold of. You can get a hold of me, and we can have a chat about any of these topics, or if you have a specific question that I can help you with, or perhaps even better, if you would like to present this talk in your own company or Java user group, all of those things would be most welcome, and certainly a signal for me that I've accomplished what I've set out to accomplish. So it's important to talk about why is it that that this topic is relevant to me. I think it's always important to understand why somebody is doing something, and I'll also talk about what is it that is in it for you as well. So the reality is that I've chosen a particular path in life, and I have a particular identity as well. The path in life that I've chosen is to be a technologist, and many years ago also to be an open source contributor. In addition to that, there are some chosen paths that are tied to my identity. I am an immigrant. I'm a Muslim American. I am a person of color, as you can see, of South Asian descent. I am, in general, a nonconformist. And also, I'd say I'm an idealist as well. Those are all choices that I have made for specific reasons in some cases, and some of those things are not out of my control, but certainly nothing that I am not proud of. All those parts of my identity are important to me, and all of the decisions that I've made are also important to me. But there is this sort of hidden rule that says that if you reach a certain level of accomplishment in your career, you're certainly sort of barred from talking about the journey that got you there, and in particular the good, bad, and the ugly of that journey, and sometimes uncomfortable facts along those journeys. So this is a taboo that I would like to break today, and hopefully for good reasons. I have to say that there have been a lot of hurdles and a lot of difficulties in despite those choices that I have made that really never should have been there. Some of these are represented on screen right now. I'll let you take a look at this deck later on. I don't want to dwell on these specifics too much right now because they're not that important at the end of the day. Because this talk, at the end of the day, is not about me. It is about something much broader. But I do want you to understand what my personal context in some of these things are from, and how they relate to the topic that we are about to talk about. And believe it or not, this is not just me. If you really take a look at the data and you really begin to talk about um, people that are open source contributors, and you get them to be honest about their experiences in open source, and especially if they happen to come from marginalized backgrounds, the truth of the matter is these are things that are always on our mind. And I'll be honest with you, when I began this journey, this was an issue on my mind, because the reality is that the issues that I'm talking about, the issues of incivility, the issues of verbal and psychological abuse in open source, these are nothing new, and they are also not by exception. So I'll let you take a look at this screen here that I have, and you can take a look at some of these numbers. These numbers are very, very stark. There is, of course, very high profile incidents like none other than the creator of Linux or the other issues that women typically face, including harassment that geek feminism does a very good job of cataloging. And every now and then, if you're taking a look at the tech press or the press in general, shows up every now and then. And when people actually take a look at this space and actually do studies on this topic, you can begin to take a look at these numbers. So I have some of these numbers from the latest GitHub survey for open source, and the title is "Negative Behaviors in Open Source," and you can see what is going on. So almost 50% of people have seen some kind of negative behavior or the other. The most common one being rudeness, name calling. And name calling is close to 20%. So 1 in 5 people are seeing somebody else do name calling. Serious incidents, potentially, and if you look at the geek feminism wiki, it'll be obvious to you that these are actually legally prosecutable serious incidents. And this is close to 15% that somebody has observed behavior that is most likely illegal. And of course, stereotyping being another one, and experienced disproportionately by people of color and women, and thus close to 10% that somebody has observed this kind of behavior, or 5% that has directly been affected by these behaviors. So you can see how pervasive this problem really is. So open source rightly has a reputation for these sorts of behaviors and these sorts of problems, and you can see the end result at the end of the day. For me personally, the reason I have continued with open source is because I started with a purpose. Had I not, and had I just started out of curiosity, or started out of a place where of lesser commitment, it is very likely I would have exited based on some of the experiences that I've had in the open source domain. And this happens quite frequently. And again, if you look at the surveys, many women are reporting that they started with open source, they see these toxic, very hostile environment, and they exit open source. And the results, the numbers are telltale. So in 2000 survey, in the same GitHub survey that we're talking about, 95% of contributors in open source were men, and 3% are women. Now take a look at these numbers in context. So women in the United States represent about half of the workforce. And in IT in general, it's about a quarter of the workforce. And in open source, it is only less than 5%, 3% of women that are contributing to open source. Same thing with minorities. People that identify as minorities are about a third, a little over a third of the US workforce. But guess what? Only 16%, that is half that ratio, actually contributes in open source. And I bet if you really investigated it, people that are actually doing this as a hobby, that are minorities, those numbers are even lower. There is no way you can take a rational stance at this and say that there is not a problem here, and that there's not these obstacles that we experience, and the obstacles that people are reporting, seeing, and witnessing, and experiencing are not real. They are very, very much real. But let's take for granted for a moment that all of these things are real, and these are issues that people like me, or women, or minorities, or people with disabilities, or LGBT folks, they face. But let's say you're not any of those things. Why should you care? So somebody did an experiment, a thought experiment at a university program, and asked a bunch of computer science students, presumably a diverse set, why should you care? Why does it matter? Right? Why do you care about diversity in open source? And they came up with these answers. So these are literally answers that students put up the board, and this is a graphic that you can find later. But distilling it down, it really comes down to these few reasons that I'm going to try to explain to you, and hopefully it is a convincing explanation as to why you should care about diversity in open source in particular. First and foremost, if you are not, if you do not have diversity, it is a very good signal that you are not as open as you might think. Because what is typically happening is that you're turning people away because of your lack of openness. Women and minorities are most likely coming to your open source project, taking a look at it and say, "Oh, I don't want any part of this. I need to get out of here." That is a very good signal that you are not as open as you think. So if your objective to have an open source project was openness, then you are failing at a very significant dynamic of what you are supposed to be accomplishing in the first place. More practically, what is happening by having a lack of diversity is that you are also lacking those diverse perspectives, both in terms of developing your open source project as well as people that consume your open source project. If diverse perspectives are not even part of the equation, that means that there are bugs and use cases and features that you're not even thinking of because it's not in your horizon. You're not thinking along those lines. As a result, you won't be serving that populace at all. You'll be serving a much narrower audience that only is in your visible perspective, and that's about it. What this also means is that you are not tapping into greater potential. All of those people that you are either consciously or unconsciously excluding from your open source project, those are things that could be contributing and helping moving your project forward, and you are not fulfilling your full potential in your project by essentially not being open to those people and not taking steps to bring in all of the entire spectrum of the resources that could be contributing to your project. Flip side of this is that you're not expanding your community either. If your community is welcoming, it will be as expansive as possible. By not having a diverse community, you'll be narrowing the reach of your own community. Aside from the obvious impact that you have that I already talked about in terms of what use case and what end users you would have otherwise. And similarly, it is simply an ethical imperative. If you are a person of conscience, it should simply bother you that why do I not have more people from marginalized communities? Why are these people turning away from my project? Why are they not having, even if they do come into my project, why are they not having a good experience? And what is my responsibility in that regard? So, hopefully, if you're attending this talk and you're taking the time to listen to this talk, these are more or less things you agree with. One of the things to understand, though, is why. The probable reasons. It's always important to understand the context of the problem and the probable reasons why something is a problem before you go about solving it. If you don't understand a problem, you won't be able to solve it effectively. So these are, and there are many different dynamics of this problem, but I'll share some of them with you from my own perspective. Why do these things happen? Why do we need these codes of conduct? Why is these negative behaviors in open source projects that drive away diversity? First and foremost, part of the reason is anonymity and remoteness. Open source projects are often on the web. People are not interacting in this situation face to face. They do not have daily interactions one to one as human beings. Often this is simply virtual people, somebody talking to somebody on social media or talking to somebody on a GitHub issue, and that's about it. You have that sense of disconnectivity from yourself as well as from the other person. You are thinking inadvertently or purposely, you have a level of anonymity in those type of environment. You are isolated and you're remote from the real person, and you have the sense of alternate reality that okay, this is not, somehow this does not feel like the real world, and hence there's no real world consequences. I do not need to behave the same way that I do in a real world environment, let's say with my coworker. There's also the sense of anarchy and empowerment and impunity. Again, this goes down to the fact that it is no man's land, essentially. You're talking about an open source project. This is just code sitting in an open repository somewhere on the internet. Nobody is in charge, if you will. Nobody has any responsibility, and as a result, you can sort of get away with whatever it is that you like. There's no sense of right and wrong, and no sense of there is a norms that you need to follow that would normally be the case in a workplace setting, for example. Another interesting aspect of all of this is the concept of cliques, tribalism, and exclusion. And when you take a look at the United States and what is happening in terms of our divisions, this will be very, very obvious as to what the problem here is. As human beings, we have this unfortunate tendency of separating us versus them along arbitrary lines. And in fact, there's very good indication that this is behavior that we have inherited from our evolutionary past. If you look at our closest animal relatives, like primates, like baboons or perhaps chimps, and the way these chimps and baboons and these animals behave reflects oftentimes how we behave as human beings in society. We treat the other as enemy, something less than us, and instead of thinking about them as equals, we really think of them as prey and predators behavior. So they are the other. Whatever they do is wrong, and this sort of territorialism and tribalism exists very much in open source, particularly in competing open source projects or technologies. I think we've all seen this. That this is an unfortunate reality, and this is one of the realities why these sorts of negative behaviors stem from. Often is the sense of us versus them. There's also some really bad roots in terms of where open source started, and why some of these problems actually occur in open source. For some reason, and this is a problem in general in society. Just a moment here. Right, I think it's all good. Sorry for the interruption. There is this idea in society, particularly in Western society, of embracing so-called meritocracy or equality. But in reality, meritocracy and equality are simply theoretical concepts. They do not actually exist in the real world. There is no such thing as true equality. There's always inequalities. There's always people that have greater privileges and greater opportunities, and greater resources that others do not have access to. And yet, in open source, we've learned to embrace, especially in about the 70s, this idea that open source is somehow different from real world, and suddenly we live in this meritocratic system, and everybody is suddenly equal because of various arguments, like you can't see, person's skin color from their name. Well, guess what? That's not exactly true. In most cases, you can figure out who somebody is very easily these days from social media. But what happens is this idea of equality stops us from thinking about what the impact of our actions are. In particular, it makes us stop thinking about things like unconscious bias, things like prejudices, things like microaggressions, things like the disproportionate impact of these negative behaviors that happens when somebody comes from a marginalized background. When these behaviors are especially experienced by somebody from a marginalized background, the effect is drastically different. First and foremost, these people are usually coming from an underprivileged background. They're already dealing with a lot of difficulties in their social context. They are often isolated because they do not feel included in society in general. On top of that, when we add the effects of these negative behaviors, it has an impact of driving these people out much more so than it would be the case if you happen to be a person that is not marginalized, and you can simply brush this off and say, oh yeah, this is just a jerk. When you are a minority and you are coming from a place that is unequal to begin with, that is not going to be your reaction. That let me just brush this off. Your reaction is going to be, I don't need to deal with this. I just need to walk away. So these are the underlying factors why we really need to think differently about this problem and why this is not a trivial problem at all. Now that we've talked about this, now the question is, what is the solution then? And the solution is right in front of us, because these are things that we have dealt with as a human society for a very, very long time. The reality is there are definite darker aspects and negative aspects to what it means to be a human. While there are many good things about us as a species, there is also selfishness, greed, uh, insecurity, in general, lack of civility and lack of regard for others, lack of empathy. You can see this reflected in civil society. There's a reason why, for a long period of time, for thousands of years now, we have developed the concept of codes of conduct. It is to regulate these negative behaviors that otherwise would occur if there are no rules and regulations and nobody is watching. Some examples of this, as you can see, is religion. Some examples of this is things like conventions, like the Geneva Conventions, and things like codes of conduct for physicians. These are all attempts to basically solve this fundamental problem of regulating behavior and making sure wrong things do not happen when nobody is watching. So this is the very same thing that we need to do in open source projects as well, and in fact, even more broadly speaking, in social media. We need to apply these same type of concepts. In fact, it is kind of shocking when you think about it, why we ever thought that if you just put some everybody on the planet on the internet and it's everything is open and it's complete anarchy, that bad things would not happen. We should have figured this out a long time ago, in fact. The good thing is people have been figuring this out. And in fact, they've been figuring this out in the past decade or so, because of these high-profile incidents, and because of people like minorities and people of color and LGBT communities speaking about this problem, about saying, hey, we cannot contribute to open source because it's just a hostile and toxic place. And the answer has been to develop these codes of conduct. And thankfully, companies are also beginning to wake up to this problem, because guess what? The reality is a vast majority of open source contribution still comes from people that are paid to actually work on open source projects. So the irony of all of this is that these are people that would never behave this way in the real world, in their work environment, and suddenly have these negative behaviors when they are contributing to open source projects and getting paid to do it. So it's a very good thing that companies and organizations are finally realizing that there's a problem here that needs to be addressed, and we need to deal with these problems, and the answer is codes of conduct. So there are a few different codes of conduct out there, well-known ones and well adopted ones. One of the most significant ones being one of the more significant ones being the contributor covenant. It's actually the most widely regarded and most widely adopted open source code of conduct out there. So I've left a link to the contributor covenant, and there's several things that why the contributor covenant is so good. So let's talk about now what makes a good, effective code of conduct. So first and foremost, a code of conduct needs to be clear and simple. If nobody can read your code of conduct and understand what you mean, it's not an effective code of conduct. It should be something that everybody should be able to clearly understand its intent, and what is it that crosses the line in terms of behavior that's not acceptable. It has to be based on concrete principles and objectives that align with your project. You should be able to communicate not just what the rules are, but why the rules exist. What are the values alignment? What are the things that you are trying to accomplish in the end? There should be sufficiently detailed and include examples, not just a high-level statement. In case of Linux, they used to have a code of conduct that says, be excellent to each other. Well, guess what? That one line code of conduct didn't do much good, because at the end of the day, Linux community, in the Linux community, we have seen the most worse cases of verbal abuse and negative behaviors. So codes of conduct need to be sufficiently detailed. You need to talk about what precisely you don't want, and you need to include examples of what those behaviors are, both positive and negative examples. Examples of behaviors you want and examples of behavior that you do not want. Now, no matter how well you write your code of conduct, there will always be a space where something is unclear. So you need to have resources for people to go ask questions and ask for clarification about their code of conduct, about the written code of conduct if they need clarification. Finally, there needs to be explicit details on reporting and enforcement. I see a lot of open source projects that only adopt a code of conduct in name. They slap it up on their website, and that is all that there is. There is not even any details on who is enforcing it. So you need to have a reporting and enforcement process, and you need to have a clear reporting and enhancement mechanism. And finally, it needs to be prominently praised. It's not just a matter of, oh, I added a section of a README file in a GitHub project, or I have this code of conduct file in my in my GitHub repo, and that's good enough, but nobody will ever see it unless they're looking. So it needs to be as prominently placed as possible in order to be effective. This is a signal to everybody in your community that this is important and it needs to be dealt with. So let's now talk about the Jakarta Ambassadors. And I'll show you by example what I mean by all of these things that I talked about in terms of what makes a good code of conduct. So let me talk to you, first of all, a little bit about what the Jakarta Ambassadors are. The Jakarta Ambassadors are basically a grassroots. This is the website for the Jakarta Ambassadors. I happen to be one of the founding members of the Jakarta Ambassadors. We are essentially in the enterprise, cloud native enterprise Java domain. Jakarta E is basically the technology that was formerly known as Java E. And basically, we are essentially a grassroots group of people, mostly not vendors, mostly just ordinary developers out there that contribute to Jakarta E in various different ways because we value this technology and we want this technology to move forward. So in the very first page, that we have a prominent link to our code of conduct, and we talk about why the code of conduct is important. It is very prominent. You cannot really miss it if you're visiting and reading about what the Jakarta Ambassadors are. And it's a top level page. You can reach it. It's not a sub level page somewhere. As you can see, it is a direct child of the top of the website. There's a code of conduct, and it's a well understood URL. In here, we also talk about why the code of conduct is important to us. So what is the values alignment? Why do we care about code of conduct, and why do we have a code of conduct in place, and what code of conduct did we adopt? So you can create your own code of conduct. I would advise not to do that because you'll most likely get it wrong. It is very difficult to get the code of conduct right, and so you should really start with a well-known example like the contributor covenant. And in case of the Jakarta Ambassadors, what we found was the contributor covenant is just perfect for us. There's not much we need to do. We just need to add a few more details. But here we really talk about what the value proposition is. Why are we adopting a code of conduct and why it is valuable to us? We also talk about, well, what are we doing? The fact that we are actively enforcing our code of conduct in all of our domains, in all of the spaces where people can either be affected by us or we can be affected by somebody else. And there's also details of who is enforcing the code of conduct and how it is enforced and what happens when you violate the code of conduct. What are the consequences and what are the process by which you deal with these things? And there's also a link to further clarification and a link on how you go about reporting code of conduct issues. Now, if you look at the code of contributor covenant itself, let's take a look at some of its characteristics. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong one. Here's the actual code of conduct. And it talks about what are the objectives, again, what are we trying to achieve. It talks about what the standards are, some specific examples, and concrete, easy to understand examples of positive behaviors, the behaviors that we would like to see from people in our community, and also examples of inappropriate behaviors, things that we do not want to see. And in general, there is always the most critical sentence here is other conduct. So it's not about saying I'm going to list out every single possible positive and negative conduct. It is about saying that any conduct that is reasonably considered to be inappropriate in a professional setting. That basically covers a wide range of problems that you may not even be able to foresee. There's also, again, a reiteration of what our responsibilities are. What do we do? And what is the scope of the code of conduct, who it applies to, and in what situations does the code of conduct apply? And finally, again, enforcement details of what is going to happen and how to enforce. If you encounter a code of conduct issue, how do you go about reporting it? How do you go about appealing it? How do you go about discussing it? All of those details are in the code of conduct itself. And finally, an attribution to the original version of the contributor covenant. Okay. So code of conducts are not just about open source projects. It is, I would say, a must for open source projects. But there are many different applications of codes of conduct, and you can see all of them in action, actually. So they are definitely not just for open source projects. In fact, the Jakarta Ambassadors itself is not an open source project. We support open source projects in the Jakarta EE community, in particular the EE4J project. But we ourselves are actually not an open source project per se. We are a community, and it is equally important for us. Any community that aims for openness and open source diversity, it is important to adopt an open source code of conduct, especially when in a virtual environment. Same thing is true for things like Java user groups as well. Conferences and events. Again, it's a very important place to have a code of conduct because it is the same dynamic. It is a bunch of people that don't know anything about each other, gathering temporarily in a highly anonymous place where there is possible isolation. And that is why in conferences and events, it is very, very important to have a code of conduct. Almost every single conference actually has one these days, including TDC. And you can see the Eclipse Foundation, where the Jakarta E project is. Same thing with them. They are obviously a open source development organization, and hence they have adopted the code of conduct. And guess what? It's the same contributor covenant that they have chosen to adopt as well. So it's a very widely adopted code of conduct out there. And finally, companies. So you can see an example of Microsoft actually has adopted a variation again of the contributor covenant. Why is that? It is to deal with two different problems. It is to deal with what happens when Microsoft employees go out in the open source domain and begin contributing, and reminding them that they have a responsibility of how to conduct themselves when they are outside of the walls of Microsoft. And also what to do when these Microsoft employees go out there and are interacting with people that are non-Microsoft employees and are not subject to the same professional standards that we have as Microsoft employees. So this is another reason why companies that have some kind of community engagement, have some kind of open source contribution, that these companies should also have a code of conduct. So a code of conduct is a very important tool. It is perhaps the most important tool in terms of open source projects to advance diversity and inclusion. If there's one diversity and inclusion problem in open source, it is that toxic and hostile environment that we have that we need to address. There are many different, thankfully, examples and best practices that you can leverage, because people have been trying to solve it. People from marginalized communities and their allies have been trying to solve these problems for over 10 years now. So there's a lot of material that you can leverage. You do not have to start from scratch when you're dealing with these problems. And it has much wider applicability much wider than just open source projects. In fact, one variation of a code of conduct is social media participation policies. That is also something to think about. It again is the same problem, just a different domain. It's not open source, it's social media, and it's employees that are being paid to often be on social media and have negative behaviors because they're outside of their corporate walls. So that behavior also needs to be regulated through some kind of code of conduct. So here's some resources. I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to wrap things up here. So I have a link to the contributor covenant. By the way, you can get access to this slide deck. It is already posted on Speaker Deck. I've already posted it. If you simply Google the title of this talk, you should be able to land on that slide deck right away. So you'll be able to find those links. So first and foremost is the contributor covenant. I think it's an excellent example of a code of conduct that most projects should be able to adopt just as is. There's also the open source guide of code of conduct, and this explains a bit more about code of conduct issues. Again, some of the same topics that I talked about today are condensed and explained in a different fashion in that resource for the open source guide of code of conduct. And then finally, I want to also leave you with a link for general diversity issues in open source software, and that indirectly will actually reference some of the statistics that I showed you earlier, and the fact that it is a well-known issue in open source projects that we really need to deal with. Again, there are open source communities that have gotten this right and they've made vast improvements. Python and Ruby are examples of that. But by and large, this is a problem that still exists in open source, and definitely, in my experience, exists in the Java community. And we need to do our part to make sure that this is a better situation for everyone. And that is the end of my presentation. Really appreciate your time.